Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society and to the latest installment of our history group. I am Kay Hall. I am the Education and Community Outreach Officer here at the museum, and we're very pleased to have you join us this evening. Our speaker this evening is Professor Russell Fielding, and he's going to be sharing a little bit with us about the history of whaling, shore whaling in particular, in the Caribbean. Thank you so much for coming.
All right, good evening, everyone. I am not Russell Fielding, obviously. I am Karan Hamlin, the Curator of Natural History here at the Barbados Museum, and I'm just going to read a little bit about Professor Fielding. Russell Fielding is a visiting lecturer of environmental studies at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. He also holds visiting scholar and assistant professor positions at the Ocean Nexus program of the University of Washington in Seattle and the Department of Earth and Environmental Systems at the University of the South in Tennessee. Trained as an environmental geographer, Fielding's research focuses on human-environmental interactions in coastal and island environments. He is the author of The Wake of the Whale: Hunter Societies in the Caribbean and North Atlantic, published in 2018 by Harvard University Press. Fielding lives in St. James, Barbados, with his wife Diane and his 2 young children. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Fielding to give this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karan. Thank you to you all for coming out as well. I'm very happy to get this chance to talk with you about something that I've been studying for a long time that's very interesting to me, and it's encouraging to me to see that it's interesting to you as well. It's January in Barbados. It's the season of movement. Inhabitants from cold northern parts of the world, Europe, North America, are making their seasonal migrations to the Caribbean, just like they do every year. Some bring their young, others come to find new partners. They travel in large groups or individually, and there are new arrivals every day. I'm talking, of course, about humpback whales. Humpback whales feed in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, off the coasts of Canada, the United States, and continental Europe, and they travel to the Caribbean every winter to give birth and to raise their young. When they come here, they are hunted by people, just as they have been for the past century or more. At the same time, resident species of other whales and dolphins that live in the Caribbean year-round are also hunted on a year-round basis. This has been happening for more than a century. The original inhabitants of this part of the world, the Arawak and Carib indigenous peoples, made heavy use of marine resources. About half of the animal protein that they consumed came from the sea. They did eat whales and dolphins. However, they did not hunt them actively. Most of the evidence that we have of indigenous use of whales and dolphins comes from the finding of bones and teeth in shell middens and points to their use of stranded animals, animals that washed up on the beach on their own. The first known example of whaling, the hunting of whales and dolphins actively in this region, took place centuries later and was directed by the American whalers out of New England. We don't know when the first whale ship came to try to catch a whale in the Caribbean, but we know that the first successful catch was in 1775. It was conducted by the boat, the Two Brothers, which was captained by George Pollard out of Massachusetts, out of Nantucket. He had previously been the captain on the Essex, which is pictured here. We don't have a surviving picture of the Two Brothers, but the two ships were built very similarly. The Essex is famous for having been rammed, actually driven by a sperm whale in the Pacific Ocean and sunk while George Pollard was the captain. He made it back to shore, ironically rescued in the Two Brothers, which later became the ship that he commanded. And when he returned to Massachusetts, he told his story to a young aspiring author named Herman Melville. Melville wrote Moby Dick based on Pollard's story. If you've read all the way through Moby Dick, then I'm not going to spoil anything for you. The ship is sunk when a sperm whale, when Moby Dick rams it in the Pacific Ocean. Melville essentially told Pollard's story as Moby Dick and became one of the classics of maritime literature. The two brothers would go on to also sink, also under Pollard's command, this time off the coast of Hawaii, not struck by a whale, but instead it struck a coral reef. Its wreck was just found 12 years ago by marine archaeologists. Whalers passed through the Caribbean just like the two brothers passed through on its way to the Pacific, just like before that, the Essex passed through on its way to the Pacific, and just like the fictional Pequod in Moby Dick went on its way to the Pacific. The Caribbean was not the destination. It was a way station. Boats would stop in here particularly in Barbados, to take on supplies, to take on fresh water, and to scout for whales, because they did this literally everywhere they went. Melville has a line in Moby Dick that talks about the continued presence of lookouts aboard the whale ship. Even when they weren't in what was called the whaling grounds, the places where whales were known to be frequent, they were still looking. They would be looking as they sailed out of Nantucket Harbor. And if there was any space left in the boat, they'd be looking as they sailed into Nantucket Harbor at the end of a 2, 3, or 5-year whaling voyage. It was probably because of this vigilance that someone spotted a whale in the Caribbean, and the whalers from New England decided to take a detour. Instead of making a beeline for the Cape of South America, because there was no Panama Canal, they stayed here for a little while and hunted whales. Over time, the Caribbean became known as a place for whaling in its own right, not just as a place to stop off on your way to the Pacific. The primary port of Caribbean whaling for the entire duration of American activity in this region was Bridgetown, Barbados. A group of historical researchers went through painstakingly the whaling records that are kept in archives, mostly in New England, and compiled a list of ports of call that the American whaling boats made during their voyages. If you take Bermuda out of this list, because honestly, why is that included in the Caribbean? Barbados doubles the next most popular whaling port, which was Dominica. We had many more Yankee whalers coming in here for supplies, whaling in the waters around here, and increasingly taking on local men as laborers and whalers on board their ships. Just like is the case today with the world economy, cheap labor attracts attention from those with capital. The whaling boat captains coming out of New England quickly realized that the men in Barbados and the other Caribbean islands were just as capable and would work for far less than their New England counterparts. Over time, the ships began sailing with fewer and fewer crew members out of the ports in Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New York, and came down here to take on crew members because they knew they would find willing, able, and cheap labor in the Caribbean. Of course, these men that were hired on board the whaling ships were not working only for their pay. They were also compensated in skills. They developed the skills of a whaler so that they could then later begin whaling on their own. They would break away from these New England ship owners and start their own whaling operations. Now, they didn't use large ships like the American whalers did. They didn't need to. They had islands that were scattered throughout the Caribbean, very close to the places where the whales were found. Instead of sailing on a long voyage with a ship, they would stay on shore. The lookout would be based on a high point on mountainous islands. This was on mountains. On non-mountainous islands like Barbados, this was usually high points on buildings. They would look for whales offshore. When a whale was seen, they would send boats out from the beach to take the whale. One of the first, if not the first, local Caribbean resident to start his own whaling operation was old Bill Wallace from Bequia in St Vincent and the Grenadines. Old Bill was a native of Bequia. He's the one on the left here. He signed on board a whaling ship based in Massachusetts and sailed with them as they whaled all over the Atlantic Ocean. He never made it to the Pacific. He whaled through the Caribbean, the west coast of Africa, and the North Atlantic as well, near Newfoundland in Canada. He went ashore in Massachusetts and married the captain's daughter, convinced her to come back to Bequia with him. When he returned with his new bride, he needed a job. He started a shore-based whaling operation in Bequia, which, according to the most popular histories, was the first of its kind in the Caribbean. Another person, though, contemporary to Old Bill, named Archer, claims to have started his own whaling operation here in Barbados earlier than Old Bill started his. This isn't substantiated with as much historical evidence as Old Bill's presence in Bequia. If Archer's claim is correct, though, then Barbados is the location for the first Caribbean-driven whaling operation. That is, not based on capital from New England or capital from abroad, but locally run. It would be here, not Bequia. We do know that very soon after Old Bill started his whaling operation in Bequia, that there were 3 operations that started up here in Barbados, all on the west coast, 2 in Speightstown, 1 in Holetown. When people would see whales from shore, they would set out in boats, and sometimes the competition would be fierce between different boats. They would see the whale at the same time, or they would say that they did, and they would set out together, essentially racing one another to reach the whale offshore and bring it in. One of the first fisheries regulations passed in Barbados had to do with whaling. It said that whoever put the harpoon in the whale first claimed that whale. So it was a race. It was a rowing race from shore to the whale. When the harpoon struck, it was hands off. The team that had struck it first was the one that got it. After the whale was killed, some unlucky member of the crew would have to jump off the boat and sew its mouth shut using heavy twine. The reason for this is the species of whale that was most often caught here is a humpback whale, and these are a species that sink when they die. Other species, like the right whale, float when they die. That's actually how it got its name. It was the right whale to go hunting for because it floats when it dies. The humpback whale sinks unless you sew its mouth shut. When you do that, it holds air in its body, it floats, and it's much easier to bring back to shore. In Speightstown, they would bring the whales up alongside a jetty to butcher them. In Holetown, they would bring them right up onto the beach. I wonder if the residents of Sandy Lane know what used to take place on the beach behind the houses. Whaling all throughout the Caribbean, in fact, all throughout the world at this time, was done for oil. Think of petroleum today as an analog for what whale oil was then. It was used for lighting. It was used for industrial purposes. Watches were lubricated with whale oil. It was used to make candles. It had literally dozens of uses, just like petroleum does today. What wasn't very common was the human consumption of whale meat. Archer claims that this was popular here in Barbados. Other historical evidence is to the contrary. In Bequia, for example, we have contemporary stories of only the most impoverished residents of the island deigning to consume whale meat. They would rather eat almost anything else. It was a food of last resort. If you know anything about Bequia today, you know that that's changed. But at the time, this was a food that nobody wanted as their top choice. If Archer was right, then perhaps things were different in Barbados, which might explain why whaling took off here as early as it did. Because there was not only the market for oil to be exported, but then if we take what he says at face value, there was a local market for food as well. Over time, whaling, as it proved profitable, began to spread throughout the region. This map shows locally directed whaling operations. These are not ports. These are not only ports where American whalers would come in. Some of them are at the same location. For example, Barely in St Vincent would see American whalers coming in. These marks on the map, though, are the locally driven whaling operations. You'll see I've got a box around the Grenadines. That's because the whaling operations were so dense in that region, I couldn't even fit them on this map. So I'll show you this map. All in all, at least 11 islands in the Eastern Caribbean hosted shore-based whaling operations at the turn of the 20th century. Okay, so think of the end of the 1800s. This is the time when whaling was really at its peak. The Grenadines were the center of this. I mean, there were 4 on Bequia alone. If you've been to Bequia, you know it's a small island. There were 4 competing whaling operations. 2 of them were run by the Wallace family, old Bill Wallace's descendants, and 2 were run by the Oliviers. If you know about contemporary Bequia whaling, you know that the Oliviers are the ones that still essentially direct Bequian whaling today. Bequia became the capital of Caribbean whaling. We don't have a lot of records. I study whaling as it occurs today. Most of my interest is with the environmental and human implications of whaling in the 21st century. We don't have records now. I keep records as best I can, but there's no central repository for whaling records. Apparently this was the case 200 years ago as well. In the 1800s, we just have scant records from a variety of islands. In Barbados, as you can see here, in the turn of the 20th century, whaling was occurring regularly, but it wasn't prevalent. The average was about 11 whales per year. The maximum, the most that were ever taken, was 37 whales in 1901. Now, whales are large. Humpback whales are large animals. 37 of them provides a lot of oil, and if the food was being consumed, a lot of meat. So this was not anything insignificant, but still, when you compare it to the catch records from the American whalers, for example, of the same time period in the Pacific, where they were taking hundreds of whales per year. If you compare it to the era of commercial whaling in the second half of the 20th century, when they were literally driving some populations to extinction, you see that whaling in Barbados and in the surrounding islands was not as prevalent as some of the comparisons could be. However, it was prevalent enough because as the 20th century progressed, the number of whaling stations throughout the region declined rapidly, to the point that today, only 2 places host regular full-time whaling operations. One is Barely in St Vincent, the other is the island of Bequia. We'll talk about those in just a minute. The technology that is used and that continued to be used throughout the history of Caribbean whaling changed very little. You can see these 2 pictures of whaling boats taken almost a century apart. There are some differences. There's a motor on the modern boat, but the structure, the actual boat building, has remained relatively similar for over 100 years. You know, when you study history, you're often confined to documents, right? Especially if you're studying a history that took place so long ago that there's no one alive who remembers it. I'm fortunate in what I study because when I want to learn about historical Caribbean whaling, there's a place I can go and see it actually happening. These are the islands of St. Vincent and Bequia. I've circled the locations where the whaling takes place. Barely on the west coast of St. Vincent. Paget Farm is the de facto headquarters of whaling on the south coast of Bequia. These are some of the species that are taken. Still hunting humpback whales, but some small animals too. This is a little bit dark. This is the short-finned pilot whale, a large species of dolphin. Even larger dolphin is the killer whale. And then I used the spinner dolphin as sort of a stand-in for about a dozen other species of small dolphin. In Bequia, they hunt humpback whales only. That's the only species that they take from that island, and they're regulated by the International Whaling Commission. They're limited to 4 per year, and they have to meet certain criteria to continue doing this. Because all of these smaller whales and dolphins are not protected internationally by something like the International Whaling Commission, they're regulated only by Vincentian local law. That's why in Barely, there's so much more whaling that goes on, and they're hunting so many other species. This is what whaling looks like as it occurs today. If you can just use your imagination a little bit, you can take this picture and transform it into what whaling looked like 100 years ago as well. You'd replace the outboard engine with a sail, you'd stick a few more people in the boat, and you'd give them oars to row. You'd take the harpoon gun off the front, and you'd use a hand-thrown harpoon. Other than that, this is essentially the same thing. I spent about 3 months of my life working on board one of these whale boats. I went out 6 days a week for about 11 hours per day hunting whales, taking down data, tracking the courses that we followed, and helping as much as I could with the operation. Only 3 people ride aboard the boat. For me to have a spot on the boat, somebody had to stay on shore. So I tried as best as I could to do his job. This is what it looks like. When a whale or dolphin is sighted, the harpooner lines up the gun. 100 years ago, it would have been a hand-thrown harpoon. He fires. The harpoon is attached to a rope, which itself is attached to the boat, and the whale or dolphin is hauled in by hand. This is what we did day in, day out, hauling these whales or these dolphins up against the boat. If they're small, like this Risso's dolphin, they're hauled onto the boat, inside the boat itself, so they don't provide any drag when you're motoring around to find more whales. If they're large, like the killer whales or the pilot whales in the previous picture, they're tied alongside. It's not ideal, but there's not enough room inside the boat. When you get to shore, the whales are hauled onto the beach, again by hand. Their meat is cut into thin strips that is hung on bamboo poles to dry. Their blubber is cooked over fire to produce oil, which is in the yellow bin here. And then the blubber itself is consumed as kind of a snack product. This is what the food products look like and have looked like for the past century. That's whaling on St. Vincent Island. That's the barely whaling operation that targets those smaller animals. This is what whaling looks like in Bequia. And again, what it has looked like for generations. A sailboat sets out, still a sailboat in Bequia. The reason for this is that the permission that they're given from the International Whaling Commission is under the auspices of Aboriginal subsistence whaling. In order to appear more traditional, they use sailboats to hunt the whales. There's actually no rule in the International Whaling Commission's policies that says they must do this. Other Aboriginal subsistence whalers, like the Inuit in Alaska, use motorboats. They actually use semi-automatic rifles as well. In Bequia, they stick to the traditional forms of whaling so as to be more authentic with what they're claiming that they do. Personally, I admire that. It makes it more difficult, but they stick with it anyway. When they approach a humpback whale, this is again where they hunt the large ones 4 times per year. A hand-thrown harpoon is tossed into the whale. Usually it takes more than one hand-thrown harpoon to adequately fix the whale to the boat. Rather than dragging the whale back to shore, often the whale drags the boat for quite a distance. This is a phenomenon that got the name Nantucket sleigh ride back during the period of American whaling. I think it should be called a Bequia sleigh ride today. That's where it's still happening. Over time, the whale tires out. You would too if you were dragging a boat full of men through the Caribbean Sea. He's hit with more and more harpoons. Eventually they bring out the lance, which is like a harpoon without the toggling head. It's just a long stave. They stick the whale, it's killed, and they drag it into Simples Cay where it's processed. Simples Cay is a small islet off the coast of Bequia. When this happens, everything in Bequia shuts down. Schools let out, shops close, everyone turns up at or near Simples Cay to get their share of the whale. Now the whalers have first dibs, of course. They take off the saleable parts of the meat and the blubber, prepare it, cut it into regular sizes, and sell it to the public. Sometimes they sell it through middlemen, sometimes they sell it directly. Interestingly though, after all of these saleable parts are removed, the carcass is made available to the public. Members of the Bequian and visiting public who maybe don't have enough money to purchase the meat or blubber are able to go into the sea and cut it themselves. It's still a community event, even in modern times. This is what the food products look like. We've got raw meat on top that hasn't been cooked. We've got blubber on the bottom that has been cooked. Blubber is the fatty tissue of the whale. And then in the back, we've got what's called doved meat, which is basically the whale meat, the lean meat, boiled or fried in its own oil. Let's look at some statistics. Whaling in barely, for the small animals, I mentioned does not have very good record keeping associated with it. There are several gaps here where we don't have any data, but it follows cycles of boom and bust. As you can see, there are peaks and valleys in this chart. In the 1980s, it was predicted the whaling was going to stop. If it had, it would have echoed what happened throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Eastern Caribbean, as whaling operations overexploited the whale populations, weren't getting enough return on their effort, and decided to close up shop. That's what happened in Barbados. That's what happened at all of those other islands except Bequia and St. Vincent. It almost happened in St. Vincent in the 1980s. What did they do to avoid that? They shifted their attention from certain species to other species that they hadn't been exploiting and allowed those other species the kind of rest they needed to rebound their populations. In Bequia, where whaling is much more regulated, remember they're limited to 4 whales per year by the International Whaling Commission, this is what the record looks like. I start here at 1986, that's when the Aboriginal subsistence quota was initiated. Before that, it was much more variable year by year. Sometimes they would catch much more, up to 50 or so per year. When the International Whaling Commission came in, limited them to 4, they have stuck more or less to that number since then. Where they get most of their violations are with what's called struck and lost whales. They'll strike one with a harpoon, won't get in the water quickly enough to sew it up, or it'll break free in some way, and it dies on its own, a total waste. The whale dies, people don't get any meat or blubber, it's a loss for everyone. That's what they try to avoid. That's what the International Whaling Commission wants them to avoid, and those are numbers that are not shown here on this chart. What I'm interested in most, though, in addition to the ecology that is shown by these charts, how many whales are we taking out of the ocean, is this information. How much are people eating? I grew up in Florida in the US. We would see dolphins sometimes from shore, never thought about eating one. You go to a restaurant with people that are visiting from out of state and you see dolphin on the menu, it's always the same joke, right? You have to tell them it's actually a mahi-mahi or a dorado. Nobody thought of eating mammals. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, these are popular food products. I asked participants in a survey how often they used the 3 different products, the meat, the blubber, and the oil. Oil's used as kind of a remedy for colds. You'll take a teaspoon of it. It's sometimes applied to the skin or to the hair. And you see that blubber is more popular among male respondents, oil by far among female respondents, but meat is kind of the same amount of popularity among both. And if you do the math, if you follow this down here, the blue line is right about 25 times per year. So that's about once every 2 weeks. I try to think of my own diet and what I eat about once every 2 weeks. And when I was living in the US, I think it was pizza. Now in Barbados, I think it's curry. There's something that I eat regularly, but not every day, right? It's not my mainstay. It's just something that is a regular part of my diet. I'm sure you can think of something that is that for you. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, to the majority of my respondents, it's whale. It's whale meat. This number, once per 2 weeks, stands out for another reason. And it has to do with a part of my own research career in the more distant past that took place here in the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands is an archipelago in the North Atlantic. It's a dependency of Denmark, so it's like, I don't know, like Guadeloupe is to France, for example, or like Bermuda is to the UK. The Faroe Islands are to Denmark. They hunt whales there as well. They actually hunt similar species to the whales that are hunted in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, at least to the ones that are hunted on the main island of St. Vincent. These are smaller cetaceans, the pilot whale, and then a couple of other smaller whales. I've conducted surveys there too with the public about how much they eat, and it's about once every 2 weeks. It's about the same frequency as it is in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So these are an easy comparison. These 2 countries at opposite ends of the North Atlantic are an easy comparison on this one special area. This is what whaling looks like in the Faroe Islands. It's very different. They don't use harpoons. They actually chase the entire pod of whales into the beach. You may have seen these on the news where the entire bay is red from the blood that is spilled. They kill hundreds of whales at a time because they've driven them all onto the beach at the same time. I'll spare you those gory pictures. A quick Google will turn them up if you're interested, though. There's a much longer whaling history in the Faroe Islands. We have records that go back to the 1500s. It's suspected that whaling began at least 500 years before that. So it's a very old tradition there. It's something that is very much ingrained into the culture. However, things began to change in the Faroe Islands in the late 20th century. It was discovered that mercury and other environmental pollutants were accumulating in the tissues of the whales that they were hunting for food. In 1978, scientists found 1.5 parts per million. That's what the Greek symbols there mean. Think about this, parts per million. For every part, every gram, for example, of whale tissue, you've got 1.5 grams of mercury. That was enough to scare them into action. At the time, the Danish standard, the Danish limit essentially for mercury consumption was 0.5 part per million. So this was 3 times what the Danish standard said. They sprung into action. They started issuing dietary recommendations, not laws, not prohibitions, but recommendations, saying, if you want to promote your own health, limit your consumption to once per week. And then when they've discovered more higher levels of mercury, maybe once per 2 weeks. A little bit later, as the mercury levels continued to climb, once per month, and if you're pregnant, stay away from it altogether. A little bit later, women stay away from it altogether until you've gone through menopause. The biggest problem was that a woman could accumulate these pollutants in her body even if she was not pregnant, and then later in life, when she did get pregnant, she could pass them on to her baby. So the instruction, the advice was for premenopausal women to avoid altogether, for men and postmenopausal women to eat sparingly. Things changed in 2008. The research in the Faroe Islands was still continuing on mercury presence. The levels got so high that the authorities there made this recommendation, that pilot whale, which is the main species they catch, is no longer used for human consumption. Remember how long they'd been whaling. We have records that go back to the 1500s. We have estimates from historians that say that it goes back to about the year 1000. This was never done for oil. This was always done for food. It was like Barely or Bequay, or for a brief period of time, Barbados, times 1,000. Right? The relevance of whale to the diet and culture of the Faroe Islands cannot be overstated. And the recommendation in 2008 was to stop. People didn't stop. In the Faroe Islands today, even though it's 12 years on, this is a major point of contention between people in the government, between parties in the government, and sometimes even between members of the same household. One individual will want to eat whale and serve it to the kids, the other doesn't, and they fight about this. Well, how's that going to play out in St. Vincent and the Grenadines? We have two questions, right? How popular is this, and how much contamination is there? That's where my research has been focused over the last several years. We should start a baseline. What do people know about the health value of pilot whale meat? Is it healthy? According to surveys I've conducted with hundreds of respondents throughout St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the common belief is that it is a healthy food. Right? The meat, the blubber, take the oil if you're sick, it's all healthy. 2/3 unequivocally said yes. Another 19% didn't know for sure. Could be convinced either way. In the Faroe Islands, at the most recent count, at least the most recent scientific literature that I've got, the amount of mercury had increased from 1.5 to 2 parts per million. Interestingly, the standard has also increased. Right? So if something's going along and you don't like it, you just raise your standards, or I guess in this case, lower your standards, right, to accommodate for changing conditions. So now that Denmark is part of the EU, they use the EU standard rather than a Danish standard itself. It's 1 part per million, but the Faroese concentration of mercury is still exceeding this, right? It's about double right now. Incidentally, the EU standard is based on the World Health Organization standard. So I don't want you to think of it as something specific to European physiology, right? This is meant for worldwide advice. Any person in any country in the world should not consume any food product that has more than 1 part per million of mercury. For the past few years, I've been taking tissue samples from the whales and dolphins caught in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and have been analyzing them in a lab for mercury concentrations. Just this year, it's just come out, finally published. We've got our paper that really lays out all of our findings over the years. And if you boil it all down, there's dozens of numbers all throughout the paper, but if you boil it all down to one number, the average, the mean concentration of mercury in the meat of the whales and dolphins caught in St. Vincent, this is what you have. The whale meat in St. Vincent is contaminated with mercury at levels 20 times higher than the World Health Organization says people should eat. So clearly what needs to happen is this, right? This is an article from the Vincentian. It's a local newspaper in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It was written, incidentally, by a local Vincentian anti-whaling activist named Paul Lewis. And he's saying goodbye to the whale hunt for several reasons. He says it's outdated, it's cruel, whales and dolphins are going extinct, the tourists don't want to see it, and oh, by the way, there's mercury in the meat. Is the whale hunt disappearing? I went back and did another survey in 2018. This is what I found. Do you consume any whale or dolphin product at all? Humpback meat, blackfish meat, blubber, oil, any of that? 77%, yes we do. Goodbye to the whale hunt may be a bit premature. The whale hunt doesn't seem to be going away at all. So what do? I'm a scientist. I am not here to make dietary recommendations to people. I'm not even qualified to do that. What I can do is collect data and share it with the people whose job it is to make these recommendations. And that's what I'm doing. I bring students to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, both from the US and hopefully soon from UE, if we can work out the funding. We do interviews with individuals about how much they eat, about not just how much they eat, but what it means to them. Because your cultural attachment to a food means a lot when somebody else is telling you that you need to give that food up. We continue to take samples and analyze them for contaminants. Mercury is just one of the suite of contaminants that we're finding in these animals. You've heard of microplastics? That's the new kind of buzzword in environmental contamination. We're finding them in the tissues that people eat of these whales and dolphins. I'm looking through processes of geospatial analysis to find out where this contamination is coming from and why it's so much higher down here in the Caribbean than it is up north in the North Atlantic. I have a few ideas, and we need to test those ideas out. It's interesting, some of the ideas have to do with the ocean and atmospheric currents that you see on this map. Others have to do with ecological principles of transport up the food chain. Right? Here in the tropics, the food chain is very different than it is in the North Atlantic. The amount of transfer up each level might be greater here than what we're seeing up north. But most of all, I am continuing to work with the whalers and the people associated with the whalers who were so generous to me, brought me on board their boats, allowed me to learn the skills of whaling just like my American ancestors probably taught their ancestors the skills of whaling way back in the 1800s. They took me on board the boat, they shared their lifestyle with me, they taught me what they knew and what I needed to know in order to do the work that I do. What breaks my heart is that the research that I'm conducting is most likely, eventually, going to have to result in the end of this way of life. My goal now is to try to make that transition a smooth one. So to that end, I'm spending this year in Barbados as a visiting lecturer here at UE. I'm making frequent trips over to St. Vincent and the Grenadines to meet with my colleagues in the Ministries of Fisheries and Health, and we're working on ways to get this information out to the public in a way that doesn't cause panic, but promotes health. And that's hopefully what we'll be doing for the next year or so. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to take any questions that you have. Karen, do you want me to call on people? Okay. Yes, sir.
Do they actually eat blubber? Isn't that just pure fat?
Yeah, so the question is, do they eat blubber? They do. So it is pure fat. So if you've ever, cooked bacon or something, that's kind of the equivalent, I guess. It is just pure fat. They cook it over fire. It extrudes the oil. That's how the old whalers used to get oil for industrial purposes. And then, of course, they would just throw out the blubber. But now the blubber itself is the product. In St. Vincent, it makes a food product called crips, which people buy in those bags and just sort of eat maybe like you would popcorn.
So it's like chitlins.
Like chitlins. So chitlins, as I understand, is the intestines of a pig. Yeah, like pork fat, like pork rinds, for example. Yeah, or there's another name. It's like chitlins. I know what you're talking about. Cracklins, that's it. Yeah, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
The people in St. Vincent and Beckley being tested for mercury toxicity?
They have. There was a study that was done in the late 90s that looked at mercury levels in something like a dozen countries around the Caribbean, both the islands and the east coast of Central America, and compared what they found. St. Vincent average levels came in second to Belize, where there are active gold mines, which is another major source of mercury toxicity. That study was not at all based on seafood consumption or whale consumption. It wasn't correlating any of those things, so we don't know if the people who tested high for mercury also eat a lot of whale. We're doing a new study to actually correlate those two variables. So it's in the works. There is some funding, I hope, coming along soon. And once that is in place, we will be conducting surveys along with sampling of people's hair, which can be analyzed to see how much mercury they have in their system. Yes, sir.
I fish quite a bit. I've seen the humpback stocks on North Point quite a lot. It's quite an amazing thing to see them. I've also visited Antarctica, and I've always told people that the whales
So
do any whales come from south?
not to the Caribbean. So humpback whales are a global species. They winter, whatever winter means for the hemisphere that you're in. They winter in the tropics and spend their summers, again, based on the hemisphere, in the poles. So those that you would have seen in Antarctica, depending on what side of Antarctica you were on, if you were near the peninsula, like south of South America, they would spend their winters, which is June, July, and August, off the west coast of Africa. So the Gulf of Guinea.
Yeah, because the ones when we see the ones here, it's usually in April, May, right?
Yeah, and that's because they start coming earlier. Those were real-time charts that I showed of them coming down from Iceland. They start in January. They migrate down. It takes a while, right? They swim down here. They spend the first part of the year, so say from January to May or so in the Caribbean, and then they return in the summer up to the North Atlantic to feed. They've actually tagged some of the humpback whales up north and seen those same whales again in the Caribbean. Yes, please.
I'm sorry because I missed the beginning of the talk, so you may have mentioned this, but I'm quite surprised that Barbados was so important for ships stopping off, because, and especially compared to Dominica, because they have a resident or semi-resident population of sperm whales,
Right.
which are a higher value whale than the humpback.
Yeah, it's a good point. So there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, the early years of the American whaling industry did not focus on sperm whales. They were too hard to catch. Okay, they were too difficult to handle. They focused on the baleen whales, like humpback whales, like right whales, and those were more common throughout the Caribbean because they would migrate. The other reason is geography. Barbados, as you know, sticks out into the Atlantic. A ship that is sailing from New England, not trying to come to the Caribbean, but instead just trying to get around South America, is going to have an easier time accessing Barbados. So a lot of those ships first started coming in here only to resupply, not to hunt whales. It was after they had established these ports, Bridgetown most of all, but Dominica and some others as well, after they had established these ports as places to visit, that they started whaling in this region. But you're exactly right that the resident population of sperm whales around Dominica drew in a lot of whalers, and I would suspect that's probably why Dominica, again, if you take Bermuda out, was the second most prevalent Caribbean whaling port. Interestingly, Dominica has completely shifted its perspective on whales. If you look up anything about whales and Dominica, it's 100% conservation and tourism. Whale watching, swim with the whales, all of this stuff is what Dominica is focusing on now. Interesting, given its place as the second most prevalent whaling port in the Caribbean just 100 years ago. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any evidence suggesting that a similar contamination level exists in the whale meat that you see in the markets in Japan?
Yes, that is probably the most well-studied case of contaminants in whale meat, and it's not as contaminated as what we're finding in the Caribbean. And again, I think this has to do with either ecology or ocean dynamics. But it is contaminated and it's higher than the recommended levels. But again, you've got a place where whale meat is deeply ingrained in the culture. Maybe not as deeply ingrained as it is in the Faroe Islands, but still, whales in Japan are a major food source. It's contaminated and yet people still consume it. I hesitate to outright blame anyone, though, for that kind of dissonance when I look at my own diet, right? I eat a lot of sweets. I eat things that are not as healthy for me as I should. When you think about more extreme cases of harming oneself, so something like smoking cigarettes, for example, a lot of people still smoke, and yet very few people could claim ignorance about the health effects of tobacco, right? We, as humans, make judgments. We do a lot of things that are both pleasurable or beneficial, but also have a downside. And we do that math, maybe consciously or subconsciously, when we make those decisions. And I think those are the same kind of calculations that are happening in places like Japan and the Faroe Islands among people that still consume. It's different in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, though, because by and large, people are not aware of the risk. I struggle so much with the desire to simply take out advertising time on the radio in St. Vincent and just broadcast this news to the people. The reason I don't do it is because I've seen what's happened in other contexts where foreign scientists have come in without taking care to think about the appropriate cultural interactions and just blare their news across a population. What normally happens is one of two extremes. Either people get so scared they give up all the whale meat and maybe even all the seafood together and turn to something less healthy, or they double down as a way of saying, don't tell me what to eat, and they eat even more than they would have before. This is why I'm taking the measured approach. It is frustrating. If you've ever been held back in something you're trying to do and you really want to get it done, you know how this feels. I'm doing it because I think that this is the best way to actually have a positive, healthy effect for the people, and to have an effect that, or to make a recommendation that can actually be complied with. But it's hard. Yes, sir.
I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm actually from Bequia.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm Bill Wallace, and Osmond is my great-grandfather.
Oh, wow.
Right? Yeah, so
You should have been up here doing this, not me.
Whaling is almost sacred in areas in Bequia. And what makes it so interesting is that people who would not normally eat certain meats for whatever reason, you can't tell them anything about whaling.
Yeah.
That's off limits, that's for everybody.
Yeah.
Alright? And it's seen, literally seen in places in Bequia. Anybody who's ever been to Bequia and you have passed the Frangipani Hotel, going down on the walk, with the next place is the whale boarding.
Yeah.
And the entrance and the jawbones about that whale. Literal jawbones about that whale. The unofficial flag of Bequia, which was created by a gentleman, Mr. Ross Lully, it's actually a whale. And as Professor Phelan said, we do hunt whales in sailboats, and the whalers in some cases take on hero-like status. The last well-known one was Lake Athlete Oliver, alright, and even somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger used to come and sit there by him because he was so impressed with his song. Alright, but what is really interesting is the mercury content. You're gonna have to ease into that.
Yeah.
Because some people will see that as an attack on this is how we do things and this is our culture and so on. But I like the information, and I wish you all the best in getting it out to the public, and hopefully we can still be associated with whaling even down the line in the conservationist effort. Because to take out whale out of that whale, they're trying to take out football out of Brazil. It's not going to happen. All right? So I wish you all the best in it, and I hope to hear good results from you.
Thank you. And one thing I want to clarify is that these mercury numbers only apply to the whales being hunted from barrelly on the main island of St. Vincent. I don't know of anyone who's tested the whale meat from the humpbacks in Bequia. I haven't, and I've never seen it in the literature. Humpbacks from other parts of the world have been tested, and the range is just across the board in terms of how much mercury they contain. I have reason to believe that humpback meat is safer than the meat taken from the main island of St. Vincent, mainly because of what humpbacks eat. You know, the phrase, you are what you eat, is actually true from an ecological perspective. If you, as a humpback, are feeding on mostly krill and plankton, you're not eating very high on the food chain. You're like the equivalent of a vegetarian. If you are like a toothed whale, like those killer whales and pilot whales being hunted in St. Vincent, you're eating very high on the food chain. So you're having many more levels to accumulate mercury through. So if I had to eat whale meat in St. Vincent and the Grenadines today, I would absolutely go for humpback from Bequia, simply because of its likelihood of being safer. I will say, though, that I used to eat it regularly while I was doing my research, and when we got these numbers back in the most recent publication that I mentioned, I stopped. It's a personal decision. And I saw you had a question.
So, aside from, well, a little aside, we've recently had major influxes of sargassum into the Caribbean, and because of the proposition for using sargassum for agriculture and other things, this sargassum has been tested in a number of places, and it was found to be highly contaminated with heavy metals. And those heavy metals included arsenic, cadmium, and mercury. And sargassum, as you know, this particular sargassum is picking up, it's also, you know, a plant, so it's just growing and taking up nutrients. It's known to be a bioabsorptor, so it's known to easily take up these heavy metals and other things. But it's clear that it's coming from the waters within our region and not externally, because that's where the sargassum is growing. So my question is, while I know the whales are feeding outside of the region, knowing that there are heavy metals and other contaminants, we do have lots of gold mining and so on coming off Africa as well as coming off
South America.
Yeah. So what would your thoughts be on eating fish that are grown locally in the region? For example, dolphin and other kind of top level-ish predators that would be feeding on fish that would affect through the food chain. That's one. And then the second question with regards to contaminated food is that, for example, grapes and strawberries and apples are normally found in the dirty desert, which is a list put out in the States talking about pesticide residue in the skins of fruits. And that has not at all, it seems, affected the consumption of grapes and strawberries and so on by people, even knowing that these pesticide levels are quite high and that they're pretty harmful. Note that they're residual levels, so it's not, you know, above the standards, but you're eating them people eat them, do consume them quite regularly. So knowing that there are harmful substances associated with your food doesn't historically at least seem to have an impact on what people choose to consume. I believe it's maybe the linking of whatever harmful substance is there with an illness. Yeah. So a link between mercury and cancer, or a link between mercury and some birth defects or mental health or whatever, that I think would have perhaps a stronger impact than just telling people there's mercury in your food, because they might just say, okay, so what?
Yeah, thank you for all that. I think to your first question about fish consumption, you're exactly right. I mean, if it's in the pilot whales and the dolphins, it's also in those high food chain fish species as well, the tuna, the swordfish, the marlin. The best rule for avoiding contaminants is to eat low on the food chain. And that's across the board. That's whether you live in the Caribbean or you live in the middle of the desert. I mean, a person who is vegetarian is going to, across the board, take in less contaminants than a person who eats meat. A person who eats meat but restricts themselves to herbivores, so cows and sheep, chickens, is going to take in less contaminants than a person who eats predators, like predatory fish, or in the US, people hunt bears and eat them, right? So the higher on the food chain you eat, the more exposure you've got. And it really becomes an issue of choosing the appropriate level based on the risk that you're willing to accept. Your point about the strawberries is good, because if people don't see an effect, they're not going to change their behavior. Unfortunately, with mercury, and I can't speak to all the pesticides you mentioned, but with mercury specifically, it is a slow, insidious effect. It's not something like, you know, you have a meal of whale meat and your stomach hurts or you get a migraine or something the next day. It's not even the kind of thing like you eat it every day for a year and then you get cancer. It's more like you eat it regularly throughout your entire life, and your intellectual development when you're old is lower than it would have been otherwise. But how can you compare that? I mean, you don't know what you would have been back, you know, had things been different. Robert Frost famously said that taking the road less traveled has made all the difference. All due respect, he doesn't know what he's talking about. You never know what the alternative would have been. So you spend your life eating whale meat, you're as intellectual as you are, right? There's not a clone of you that didn't do it that you can compare. Instead, what we have are controlled studies where families have been recruited when women were about to give birth and asked if the researchers could follow the intellectual development of their children for life. This has happened in the Faroe Islands, it's happened in Japan, a few other places as well, and all other variables controlled for, those children that consumed whale meat throughout their life performed less well on cognitive tests of intelligence, than those who avoided it. And then there were other higher incidence of other diseases as well. Parkinson's disease is more likely among people that consume whale meat. Certain cancers, you did mention cancer, is more common. Coronary artery disease, heart disease is more common among people that do consume whale meat. The problem is that all of those things, most of those, are diseases of old age. They're not diseases that you'll see when you're young, when you're forming your dietary habits. So it becomes very difficult to change those habits as life goes on. The key is to get the information out there so that I think what's most likely is parents will change the diets of their children who are too young to choose their own food. Maybe the parents will continue consuming, but the children won't. And over generations, I think there's going to be a change. There won't be a change in my lifetime, most likely. There will be a change in maybe the lifetime of my children.
In your graph about food consumption, just like different genders, and it seemed that women were very much responsible, I guess, for utilizing it in the household. So I'm wondering if you are to have an intersection point with changing the behavior, if women potentially are that place where those decisions possibly could be made, especially for the risks to unborn children and the kind of pre-menopausal discussions that they had in Faroe Islands as well.
Probably so. And when I mentioned that there was sometimes strife within a family about whether to eat it or not, I think you know how the genders fell down on the sides of that issue, right? In the Faroe Islands, it is very common for the father to want to continue and the mother to put her foot down and say no. It's just a fact of most cultures that women plan meals. I don't know of a time that my father has cooked an entire meal for me. We would usually go out for barbecue. That's universal, or almost so. Right? So yes, you're right, that if this is going to be a generational change, it is almost certainly going to start with the women.
Are there any further questions for Professor Miller?
On behalf of the history group, I would like to give a warm thank you for sharing your research this evening with us. And thank you to everybody who has attended. Let's give another round of applause. And just a quick reminder that the genealogy group is actually meeting next week, Wednesday, January 29th, and Dr. Tara Innes will be giving a feature presentation on just who do we think we are, the front line and fault lines of genealogical DNA testing in the Caribbean. Have a great evening.
You can double task more than I can. That's impressive.
It was not fun, but it was fascinating. And I'm so glad to meet you here. And I hope that again.
Thank you. I'm very happy to. And thank you for hosting me.